The day Ida Talmadge rode into Caldwell, Kansas, her dress was torn at the hem, her dark hair was whipping wild in the September wind, and she had exactly 11 cents and a loaded derringer in her coat pocket, and only one of those things made her feel safe. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning over a cliff, half respectable and half reckless. The cattle drives had brought money and trouble in equal measure, and the town smelled of both leather and whiskey and fresh-sawn timber from buildings still going up along the main street. Ida pulled her roan mare to a stop in front of the general store and sat there a moment, looking at the town like she was sizing up an opponent before a fight. She had driven 22 miles from the property her late father had left her, a modest homestead 6 miles south of the cattle road, and she had come to Caldwell for one reason and one reason only: to find someone who could help her keep it. She had inherited the Talmadge claim 8 months ago, when her father, Samuel Talmadge, had died of a fever in late January. Samuel had been a stubborn, warm-hearted man who had believed completely in the promise of free land, in the notion that a body willing to work could carve something lasting out of the Kansas prairie. He had proven it, more or less. The homestead had good water, a solid sod house with an attached frame addition, a small barn, a kitchen garden, and 40 acres of winter wheat that had just been sown before he died. He had left it all to Ida, his only surviving child, with a note tucked inside his Bible that read simply, "Hold it, Ida girl. It's yours and it's good." Holding it had proven harder than anyone could have anticipated. Within a month of Samuel's burial, a cattle baron named Harlan Cross had sent a man to her door with an offer to buy the property. It was not a generous offer. Ida refused. The following month, she discovered that someone had pulled up stakes along her eastern fence line, pushing the boundary of Cross's adjacent range onto her wheat field. She reset the stakes herself, alone, in a March sleet storm. After that, 2 of her windows were broken in the night by a thrown rock. Her well rope was cut, and someone set fire to a corner of her barn that she managed to put out with buckets of water before it spread. The sheriff, a man named Elton Briggs, who was widely understood to take his orders from Harlan Cross along with his salary, listened to her complaints with the patient expression of a man watching a child cry over a spilled cup, and did absolutely nothing. And so Ida Talmadge had come to Caldwell to hire a man, or find one willing, who could help her hold the line that her father had asked her to hold. She tied her mare at the hitching post in front of the general store and walked in. It was warm inside, and it smelled of spices and oiled leather and the dusty sweetness of dried corn. A woman behind the counter, Mrs. Henshaw, looked up with the particular expression of a person cataloging a stranger. Ida smiled, because she had learned early that smiling could open doors that demanding could not. "Good morning," Ida said. "I'm hoping you can help me find someone." Mrs. Henshaw set down the bolt of calico she had been measuring. "Depends on who you are looking for. A man who knows this range, who is honest, and who is not in Harlan Cross's pocket." Ida paused. "I know that last part narrows it considerably." Mrs. Henshaw studied her. Then she glanced toward the back of the store, and something in that glance told Ida there was information there, just waiting to be unwrapped. "You might talk to Nelson Sheridan," Mrs. Henshaw said carefully. "He came into town 3 weeks ago. He is a rancher up from Texas, sold his spread down there for reasons he has not shared with anyone, and he has been working day wages here while he figures out his next step. He is staying at the boarding house run by Clara Moss on the north end of 2nd Street. He is an honest man. I know it because he returned $3 in change to me that I gave him in error and never once suggested he could have kept it." Ida thought $3 was a modest test of a man's character, but she also thought Mrs. Henshaw was not a fool, and that the woman was probably reporting not just the event but a pattern she had observed. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She found Nelson Sheridan not at the boarding house but in the lot beside it, splitting wood in the cool morning air without his coat, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water after a rain, somewhere between brown and green, and impossible to pin down. He was not the biggest man Ida had ever seen, but there was a steadiness in the way he moved, an economy of motion that suggested a person who never wasted anything. She guessed he was somewhere around 30, perhaps a year or two on either side of it. He looked up when she approached, set the axe down with the blade embedded in the stump, and straightened. He did not say anything immediately, which Ida found she appreciated. Most men started talking the moment they saw a woman walking toward them. "Mr. Sheridan," she said, "my name is Ida Talmadge. I was told by Mrs. Henshaw that you might be a man worth speaking to." He considered that for a moment. "Mrs. Henshaw is generous," he said. His voice was unhurried, with just a trace of Texas in it, like a color rubbed mostly out of a cloth. "What is it you need to speak about?" "I need someone to help me protect my homestead from a man who wants to take it from me," she said plainly, because she had decided on the ride over that she would not dress it up. "Harlan Cross has been making my life difficult since my father died in January. My sheriff is useless. My neighbors are afraid of Cross, and I cannot blame them. I have 40 acres of winter wheat in the ground and a sod house and a barn that someone tried to burn down, and I intend to keep all of it. I need help with the practical matters: fence repair, security at night, and potentially someone who can stand as a witness if Cross's men come onto my land again. I cannot pay much right now, but after the wheat harvest I can pay wages plus a cut, and I will feed whoever helps me and provide a bed in the barn that I can make comfortable." Nelson Sheridan looked at her for a long, measuring moment. The wind moved the cottonwood leaves over their heads and sent them spinning gold across the yard. "You are the Talmadge girl from south of the cattle road," he said. It was not a question. "I am Ida Talmadge," she said, and the slight edge in her voice carried the clear message that she was 24 years old and a woman, not a girl, though she kept it polite. "Yes." A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in that direction. "I heard about your situation," he said. "People at the feed store were talking about it last week. I did not know your name, but I heard about a woman homesteader south of town who had Harlan Cross after her land." He was quiet for a moment. "I had dealings with a man like Cross once down in Texas. It did not go well for the man who needed help because nobody offered any in time." He picked up his coat from the fence post and pulled it on. "I do not have pressing business today." "Would you show me the property?" Ida had expected negotiation or refusal, or at least more questions. She had not expected simple agreement. "Now," she said. "Unless you have a reason to wait," he said. She did not, and they rode south together through the thin autumn sunshine, Ida on her roan mare and Nelson on a solid, well-kept bay gelding that moved like it had been trained by someone patient. They did not say much on the ride out, which Ida also found she appreciated. The silence was not awkward. It was the quiet of two people sizing up a situation rather than trying to impress each other. When they reached the Talmadge claim, Nelson rode the perimeter fence line without being asked, slowly and carefully, observing the repaired places where the stakes had been pulled and noting where the eastern line sat in relation to a dry wash that marked the unofficial border of Cross's range. He dismounted and crouched beside a stretch of fence where the wire had been repaired with a different gauge, running his fingers along it. He looked toward the barn at the scorched corner that Ida had painted over with whitewash when she replanked it. He did not say anything for a long while. "Your eastern fence is right," he said at last. "You set it back where it belongs. He will push it again, probably this winter when he figures you cannot check it as often." He looked at the wheat field, green-tipped and just visible in the brown prairie. "Good stand," he said, and it sounded like a real observation, not a compliment. "My father sowed it before he died," Ida said. "He was a good farmer. I can see that." Nelson stood, brushed his hands on his trousers, and looked at the sod house with the frame addition, the barn, the kitchen garden gone dormant now, the whole small, hard-won place. "I will help you," he said. "Not just as a hired hand if that is agreeable. I will tell you what I think and you can take it or leave it and we will sort out payment after the harvest. One condition." "Name it," she said. "You stop trying to do all of it alone," he said, not unkindly. "A person can be capable and still need help. Those are not opposites." Ida thought about the March sleet storm and resetting the fence stakes alone with numb hands. She thought about the night she had sat up until dawn with a bucket of water and a wet burlap sack fighting the barn fire by herself. She thought about driving to the sheriff's office 3 separate times and being sent home with nothing but empty words. "Agreed," she said, and the word cost her something, because she was not a woman who found depending on others easy. But she said it honestly. Nelson moved his things from Clara Moss's boarding house to the Talmadge barn the next morning. He brought a bedroll, a wooden chest, a Winchester rifle, and a small leather travel kit. He also brought, inexplicably, a collection of 6 books, which he stacked on a shelf he made from a plank of scrap wood and 2 nails. Ida noticed the books: a surveying manual, a volume of poetry by Tennyson, a dog-eared agricultural almanac, a history of Texas, a well-thumbed Bible, and a small book of mathematical tables, and thought she understood something about him from that collection, though she could not have said precisely what. They established a rhythm within the first few days. Nelson rose before dawn and checked the fence line on horseback, while Ida milked the cow and started breakfast. They ate together at the small table in the kitchen, which had the slight awkwardness of 2 strangers inhabiting close quarters but not the discomfort of incompatibility. Nelson said what he thought and did not pad it with flattery. Ida made decisions about her own property and did not ask permission, only occasionally consultation. It worked. He rebuilt the corner of the eastern fence that was most vulnerable, using heavier posts and double-stranded wire. He cut and stacked enough firewood to last through a hard winter, working steadily through the October afternoons. He repaired the hinges on the barn doors that had been hanging wrong since summer. He was methodical and careful, and he took obvious satisfaction in a thing done properly, which Ida recognized because it was a quality she shared. What she had not anticipated was the ease of his company in the evenings. After supper, when the dishes were washed and the fire was built up, they would often sit Ida at the table with mending or with her father's farm accounts, which she was determined to keep meticulously, and Nelson on the bench near the window with one of his books, or sometimes whittling, turning a piece of cottonwood into smooth, purposeful shapes while the wind worked at the eaves. They talked, sometimes, about nothing pressing. About the strange color of the Kansas sky in autumn, which was a particular hard blue unlike the blue of anywhere else either of them had been. About what they had read and thought. Nelson had opinions about things about land tenure and water rights, and the treatment of the Indian nations that had been pushed off the very ground they were now standing on, and he expressed those opinions without apology, but also without self-righteousness. Ida found herself arguing with him sometimes, not to oppose him, but because his ideas were interesting enough to push against. "You think Kansas can be settled fairly," she said one evening in mid-October, when the first real cold had come down from the north and the wheat was 2 inches high and looking good. "I think it should be," he said. He was not whittling that night. He was holding his cup of coffee with both hands, watching the fire. "Whether it can depends on whether enough people want fair more than they want easy. People like Harlan Cross have decided what they want," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is the problem." He looked at her. "But you have decided what you want too, and that counts for something." Ida looked back at him and felt, for just a moment, something that she could not name immediately and so filed away for later examination. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and a noticing of the lines of his face, of the particular quality of his attention when he looked at her, which was the attention of someone who actually saw rather than merely observed. She looked back down at her account books and said nothing more about it that night. 2 weeks later, Cross made his next move. It came in the form of 3 riders, appearing at the edge of the eastern fence line on a gray Tuesday morning in late October. Ida saw them from the kitchen window while she was kneading bread dough, and her stomach tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Nelson was at the fence already, she realized. She could see the distant shape of him and his bay horse. He had seen the riders before she had. She pulled on her coat and walked out, the derringer in her coat pocket. She did not intend to use it unless she absolutely had to, but it steadied her hand to feel the weight of it. By the time she reached Nelson, the three riders had come through the gap in the eastern fence. The gap that Cross's men had made by pulling the stakes months ago, now repaired, which meant they had cut through Nelson's new wire to enter. That made Ida's jaw tighten hard. The riders were big men on big horses, with the particular swagger of men who had been hired to intimidate rather than to work. The one in front, who wore a brown duster and a beard that wanted trimming, pulled up a few feet from Nelson and looked down at him. "We are surveying range boundaries for Mr. Cross," the man said, in the tone of a person reciting a line they had been given. "We believe this fence line is incorrectly placed." "The fence line follows the original survey markers which were filed with the county land office in 1875, Nelson said pleasantly, as though they were discussing the weather. "I can show you a copy of the plat map if that would help." The man looked at Nelson for a long beat. "That will not be necessary. Mr. Cross has his own survey." "He is welcome to file it with the county," Nelson said. "If it differs from the registered plat, the county surveyor will be happy to settle the matter. I imagine the county surveyor would love nothing more than to ride out here on a fine fall day." He paused. "Until that time, you are standing on Miss Talmadge's property, which you accessed by cutting her wire. That wire will need to be paid for." Ida stood beside Nelson, and she could feel the tension in the air like a weather change, the way it gets before a storm when the pressure drops and everything goes still and electric. She met the lead rider's eyes steadily and did not look away. The lead rider stared at Nelson for another long moment. Then he looked at Ida and at the pocket where her hand rested. He looked back at Nelson, who was simply standing there, relaxed and unhurried and entirely unmoved, and there was something in that stillness that was more unsettling than bluster would have been. "We will be back," the man said. "I expect so," Nelson said agreeably. "We will be here." The three riders turned and left. Ida watched them go until they were specks against the brown prairie, then she let out a slow breath. "That was well done," she said quietly. "They were testing," Nelson said. "Looking for nervousness or aggression. Either one would have given them something to work with." He looked at her. "You stood your ground well." "I have had practice," she said, and the wryness in her voice made him smile, really smile, which she had not seen before. It changed his face entirely, softening the steadiness into something warmer. She tucked that away too. The following week, Nelson rode into Caldwell and spent 4 hours at the county land office, emerging with a certified copy of the original plat survey for the Talmadge claim. He also spent 30 minutes speaking with a lawyer named George Whitfield, who was new to Caldwell and who did not, as far as anyone could tell, have any relationship with Harlan Cross. He brought back both the plat copy and George Whitfield's agreement to represent Ida's interests in any land dispute, at a fee that she could defer until after harvest. That evening he laid both items on the table in front of her. "A piece of paper and a lawyer," he said. "It is not a complete solution, but it is not nothing." Ida looked at the certified survey, the county clerk's seal embossed at the corner, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since January. "It is a great deal more than nothing," she said. "Thank you." He shook his head slightly. "It is your land. I just drove to the county seat." "You did it because I needed it done and I could not leave the property," she said. "That is help, and I am not too proud to say thank you for it." He looked at her across the table, and the firelight was warm and the wind was noisy outside, and they were alone and warm inside, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Nelson reached out and laid his hand briefly over hers on the table. Just a moment, just a touch. A thing done before either of them had thought it through. And then he drew back and picked up his coffee cup and said something about checking the weather glass before bed, and Ida sat very still with her hand on the table, feeling the warmth that had been left there like a coal. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark listening to the wind and thinking about things she had not permitted herself to think about since her father died, since she had locked down hard on everything soft inside herself in order to survive what the winter, and then the spring, and then the summer had required of her. She thought about what it would mean to let herself want something that was not land or wheat or legal protection. She thought about Nelson Sheridan's face in the firelight, and the way he listened to her, as though she was the most interesting person in the room, and the way he had stood in front of 3 armed riders with nothing but steadiness and a plat map. She pressed her face into her pillow and told herself very firmly to go to sleep. In November, 2 things happened that changed the current of everything. The first was that Harlan Cross came in person. He came on a Thursday morning, riding a tall gray horse, accompanied by only one man, his foreman, a narrow-eyed individual named Sutton. Cross was a heavy man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the particular confidence of someone who had been obeyed too often and for too long. He pulled up to the sod house and called out, and Ida came to the door. "Miss Talmadge," he said, without dismounting, "I have come to make you a final offer for this property. I am prepared to be generous." "You were not generous in January, Mr. Cross," Ida said. "I do not believe the passage of time has improved your instinct for fair pricing." "The price I am offering today is $800, he said. "For everything, land, structures, and the wheat in the ground." $800. It was more than the first offer, considerably more, but it was still less than half of what Ida's father had valued the property at when he filed the Homestead claim. And it was far less than what 40 acres of winter wheat would bring at market, assuming a good spring. "No," she said. Cross's expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted. "You are a young woman alone," he said. "This land is not hospitable to young women alone." "She is not alone." Nelson had come around the corner of the house with a fence tool in one hand and the easy manner of someone who had simply been working nearby and had, quite naturally, wandered over to see what the noise was. He looked up at Cross on his tall horse without any particular expression. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. Cross looked at Nelson for a long, flat moment. "Who are you?" "Nelson Sheridan. I work for Miss Talmadge." He said it the way a person states a fact. They have no emotional investment in just information, plain and clear. "Beautiful morning." Cross looked between the two of them. Whatever calculation he was making produced no visible result, but Ida could see something change in his posture, some recalibration. He had come expecting to find a lone woman near the end of her resources. He had found something else. "I will be in contact through my lawyer," Cross said, and wheeled the gray horse around and rode away with Sutton behind him. Ida turned to look at Nelson. "You were listening." "I was working," he said. "I was simply working close enough to hear." "Of course," she said, and went back inside before he could see her expression, which had gone soft in a way she was not ready to display yet. The second thing that happened in November was a blizzard. It came down on a Saturday evening with almost no warning, the sky going from gray to white in the space of an hour, the wind turning savage from the northwest, the temperature dropping so fast that the water in the buckets by the well froze while Ida was still watching. She got the cow and her mare into the barn, and Nelson got his bay in, and they worked together in the screaming wind to hang extra blankets over the horses and pile more hay than usual. By the time they were done, they could barely see the house from the barn. They stayed in the barn that first night because the snow was horizontal and the distance to the house was genuinely dangerous. Nelson built a small fire in the barrel stove in the corner of the barn, and they sat together on a pile of hay with the horses shifting and breathing warm in their stalls and the blizzard raging outside with a sound like the world coming apart at the seams. "Are you afraid of storms?" Nelson asked. Not as though he was worried she might say yes, just curious. "Not afraid," Ida said. Respectful, she pulled her coat tighter. My father was struck by lightning once, crossing a field in a summer storm. He was not killed, but it changed him. He never took weather lightly after that. He taught me not to either. That sounds like wisdom, Nelson said. It was. Ida was quiet for a moment. He was a wise man in the ways that mattered, not formally educated but thoughtful. He read everything he could get his hands on, and he thought hard about what he read. I got that from him, I suppose. The books on your shelf, Nelson said. There were several of them: history, practical guides, a worn copy of Emerson's essays that Ida had read so many times the spine had given up entirely. He started the collection. I have added to it. She looked at the barrel stove, the warm orange light dancing in the small window of the firebox. What about your family? You have said very little about Texas. Nelson was quiet for a moment. I had a ranch there, not large but solid, good land. My father built it and left it to me. He paused. 3 years ago my father died. Last year my mother. And then the cattle prices dropped and there was a drought, and the two brothers I had gone into business with had different ideas about how to respond to those things. We disagreed badly, and the partnership ended badly, and I decided to leave rather than fight them for something we had broken between us. He looked at the fire. It was my father's land, which made it the hardest thing I have ever done. Ida looked at him. I am sorry, she said quietly, and meant it completely. He nodded, acknowledging the words. So that is why I understand, he said. About your father's land, about holding it. You came here to find land of your own, Ida said. It was not a question. She was simply assembling things she had known separately into a shape. I thought I would know it when I found it, he said. He was looking at the fire, and then he turned his head and looked at her, and the way he said the next words was very careful and very honest. I believe I may have already found it. The barn was warm and the storm was enormous outside, and the horses were breathing and the light was gold. And Ida Talmadge sat completely still for 3 heartbeats, while Nelson Sheridan looked at her with his creekwater eyes and did not look away. The land, she said. Her voice was steady. She was not sure how. Among other things, he said. She looked at the fire again because she needed something to look at that would not demand anything of her face in that moment. Her heart was doing something undignified, and she was not ready to have it visible. I have not thought about. I have been so occupied with keeping this place that I have not permitted myself to think about much else, she said. It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in months. I know, he said. I am not asking you to think about it now. I just wanted you to know what I meant. The storm lasted 3 days. They took turns sleeping on the hay pile, maintaining the fire, checking the animals, eating the bread and dried meat Ida had thought to bring into the barn before the worst of it hit. By the 2nd day, the strangeness of their situation had relaxed into something almost ordinary, or not ordinary exactly, but settled, the way things become when shared difficulty burns away the unnecessary and leaves only what is real. On the 2nd night, when Nelson was sleeping and Ida was sitting up keeping the fire, she let herself simply look at him for a while, the way you can only look at someone when they cannot see you doing it. He slept with the focused stillness of a man who had learned to sleep in places where sleeping soundly was a luxury not guaranteed. She thought about what he had said, about finding what he was looking for. She thought about the way he had stood in front of Cross's riders with nothing but steadiness. She thought about 11 months of doing everything alone, of being capable and competent and desperately, quietly lonely in the way that capable people alone can be, because their capability convinces everyone, including sometimes themselves, that they need nothing. She added a log to the fire and settled back into the hay and thought, for the first time in a very long time, that perhaps the wanting was not a weakness after all. When the storm broke on the 3rd morning, they dug out the barn door together, shoulder to shoulder, working a shovel each into the packed snow. The world outside was white and blinding and transformed, the prairie so brilliant under the clearing sky that it hurt to look at it directly. The fences had held. The wheat was under the snow, dormant and protected. The barn was solid. The sod house stood like it intended to stand there forever. Ida stood in the dazzling snow and looked at her land and said, half to herself and half to the open sky, "We are still here, Papa." Nelson, beside her, heard it. He said nothing, but he stood close, and the cold air was sharp and clean, and the whole world seemed newly made. And Ida turned to look at him and found he was already looking at her, and she thought that if she waited for the moment to be perfect, she would wait forever. "I have been thinking about what you said," she told him. "In the barn." "I did not say it to put pressure on you," he said immediately. "I know that," she said. "That is part of why I have been thinking about it." She took a breath of the cold air and felt it clear all the way through. "I think perhaps I have also found something I was not expecting to find. And I think my father would have liked you very much, which I realize is a strange thing to say, but it matters to me." Nelson looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as careful hope, the expression of someone who wants a thing very much and is trying not to want it so badly that the wanting distorts their judgment. "It is not strange," he said. "It matters to me too." "All right then," she said, which was not romantic precisely, but it was honest. And in the cold white morning with the new world around them, honest felt exactly right. He smiled, the full smile she had only seen once before, and it did to her what it had done before, opened something, made the morning wider. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face where the wind had sent it, a gesture so gentle and deliberate that she felt it in her chest like a bell being struck. "All right then," he repeated, and his voice was warm. December brought cold that was less theatrical than the blizzard but more grinding, the kind of cold that settles in for a long stay and makes everything harder. It also brought the next development from Harlan Cross, which arrived in the form of a legal notice delivered by a county deputy, not Sheriff Briggs, who apparently was not personally eager to be seen doing Cross's civil errands anymore, but a younger deputy named Owens who looked apologetic about the whole thing. The notice claimed that the Talmadge fence encroached on Cross's range and demanded it be moved 12 feet to the west. Ida took the notice to George Whitfield in Caldwell, Nelson riding with her, and George Whitfield read it and then read it again, and then set it on his desk with the expression of a man who has found something unpleasant but manageable. "This is a nuisance filing," he said. "Cross knows it will not succeed, but it costs him very little to file it, and it costs you time and worry. The answer is to respond in kind. I will file a formal response with the supporting survey evidence and request that the county surveyor personally verify the boundary markers. Once the county surveyor confirms the existing markers are correct and registered, Cross will have no legal leg to stand on regarding the fence line." "And then what does he do?" Ida asked. "Then he tries something else," George said frankly. "But each time we rebuff him through legitimate channels, it gets harder for him to keep the pressure on without risking his own standing in the county. Cross is powerful, but he is not stupid. He does not want a scandal." The county surveyor came out in late December on a bone-dry, biting cold morning and spent 2 hours walking the boundary with Nelson and the plat map. He confirmed the markers. He wrote his report. George Whitfield filed it. The legal notice from Cross's lawyer went quiet. Christmas came to the Talmadge homestead on a clear, still day. The temperature was far below freezing. The sky was the hard, bright blue of winter, and the wheat was sleeping safely under 6 inches of snow. Ida had made a small Christmas cake with the last of the sugar and the dried apples she had put up in September, and she had put a ribbon on it, which she recognized was slightly absurd given the circumstances, but which she did anyway because her father had always put a ribbon on the Christmas cake. Nelson had gone to Caldwell 2 days before and come back with a small package, which he had put on the shelf with his books and not explained. On Christmas morning he gave it to her. It was wrapped in brown paper, and when she opened it she found a small volume of poetry, Emily Dickinson, published only 3 years earlier, 1875, the poems looking out at her from the page with their odd, bright intelligence. Inside the front cover he had written, in a careful, clear hand, "For Ida, who holds her ground." NS. Ida sat with the book in her hands and felt the warmth travel all the way through her, from her hands to her chest to somewhere behind her eyes that she refused to let become tears, partly from stubbornness, and partly because crying over a Christmas gift seemed like exactly the kind of thing she did not do. She looked up at Nelson and said, "This is the nicest gift anyone has given me in a long time." "It seemed like a book that would suit you," he said. "It does." She opened it carefully, reading the first poem she found with her eyes. She closed it and held it against her chest for a moment. "Nelson, I am glad you came to Caldwell." "So am I," he said, "more than I expected to be when I set out." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not had much occasion for in the long, difficult year. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Merry Christmas, Ida," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way anyone else had ever said it, deliberate, like a thing he enjoyed saying, like her name was something he had been given and intended to take care of. January was the hardest month. The cold was ferocious and unrelenting, and there were days when the simply necessary tasks of keeping themselves and the animals alive required most of the daylight hours. They got into a habit of walking the fence line together on the milder days, checking the wire for freeze damage, replacing staples that the cold had made brittle. They talked as they walked, their breath making white clouds in the gray air. They talked about everything, about what they believed in, about what they hoped for, about the harder questions that come to people when life has been sufficiently demanding to strip away the comfortable padding and leave only what is real. One afternoon in late January, walking the south fence line in a thin, pale sunlight that gave light but no warmth, Nelson asked her something he had not asked before. "What do you want? Not for the land, for yourself. If everything else were settled." Ida walked for a moment before answering. A hawk was circling high above the winter prairie, patient and exact in its spiraling. "I want to stay," she said, "here on this land. I want to see what my father built become something more than what he left it. I want children someday who know this place from birth and love it the way I love it." She paused. "I want to not be alone anymore. I have been alone most of this year, and I am very tired of it." Nelson walked beside her and was quiet for a moment. "I want the same things," he said, "all of them." She stopped walking and looked at him. He stopped too. They were in the middle of the south fence line with the winter prairie spread around them in every direction, and the hawk still circling above, and the thin sun doing its best. "Nelson," she said. "Yes," he said, and it was clear from his voice that he knew what she was about to say before she said it, and that his answer was ready. "I think I love you," she said, and her voice was steady and certain, the voice of a woman who has examined a thing carefully and arrived at a conclusion she is prepared to stand behind. He looked at her for a long, full moment, and then he crossed the small distance between them and put his hands on her face, gently, the way you handle something valuable, and said, "I know I love you, Ida Talmadge. I have known it for some time. I did not want to press you while you had so many other things pressing on you." "You could have said so sooner," she said. "You would not have been ready sooner," he said, and it was said with enough gentleness that it was not presumptuous but simply honest. She thought about it for a moment. "You are probably right," she admitted. "Infuriating, but right." He laughed, and she kissed him, there on the south fence line in the January cold, and the hawk above them circled on without comment, and the winter prairie was entirely indifferent, and none of that mattered at all. The spring came slowly, in the particular way of Kansas springs, edging in from the south in teasing increments. February was still hard and cold, but by March the temperature had begun to swing, freezing nights and days that climbed into the 40s, the snow receding in the south-facing slopes first, the ground showing through in brown patches. And through those brown patches, unmistakably, the winter wheat was pushing green. Ida walked the field in early March and counted her way across it, watching the green come up row after row, and felt something she could only call vindication, not triumph exactly, but the quieter satisfaction of a thing that was supposed to happen having happened. her father's last planting coming through exactly the way he had known it would. She pressed her hand flat against the cold earth and let herself feel it. Nelson found her there and crouched beside her. "Good stand," he said, as he had said in September, and she knew he meant it the same way, a real assessment, not flattery. "Yes," she said, "my father knew what he was doing." "So do you," he said. She stood up and brushed the earth off her hands. "I want to talk about the future," she said. "The homestead's future, our future. If you are still intending what I think you are intending." "I am," he said, without hesitation. "Then I want to know what you envision," she said. "I need to know that our visions of this place are compatible, because this land is not just property to me. It is everything my father worked for, and it is what I intend to give to my children, and I need to know that whoever shares it with me understands what it is." "I understand what it is," Nelson said. "It is a homestead that a man built from nothing and a woman is holding together with sheer will, and it has 40 acres of wheat coming up and a solid barn and a house that could be expanded, and it sits on good ground with reliable water, and it is worth 10 times what Cross has offered you." He paused. "I do not want to take it from you or reshape it according to my own vision. I want to help you build what you already have planned. This is your land, Ida. I would like to share it if you will let me." She looked at him in the March light, with the green wheat coming up around them and the sky beginning to think about turning blue again, and said, "I will let you, willingly." He had spoken with a minister in Caldwell in February, a Reverend James Cole, who ran a small Methodist congregation and who was used to performing marriages under conditions that were not always ceremonially ideal. He had not told Ida because he had wanted to wait until she brought it up, which he had understood she would do in her own time. He told her now, and she looked at him with an expression that was exasperated and fond in equal measure. "You spoke with a minister before you even told me you loved me," she said. "I spoke with him after I knew I loved you," he said. "I wanted to be ready." "You are a very deliberate man," she said. "Is that a complaint?" "Absolutely not," she said. They were married in Caldwell on a Saturday in late March, in the small Methodist church, with Mrs. Henshaw and George Whitfield and Clara Moss from the boarding house as witnesses. Ida wore a dress she had let out and taken in and pressed within an inch of its life, a pale blue wool that had been her good dress since she arrived in Kansas, and she carried 3 stems of dried wildflowers that were the only flowers available in March in Kansas, and she walked down the short aisle of the small church with the morning light coming through the plain glass windows, and thought that she could not imagine anything more perfectly suited to who she was and who she was marrying. Nelson stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his luck and was trying not to show it, and doing a poor job of not showing it, which was one of the things Ida loved most about him in that moment, that he was not composed for once, but simply happy. Reverend Cole spoke the words and they spoke theirs, and when he said, "You may kiss your bride," Nelson kissed her in the most dignified way possible under the circumstances, which still made Mrs. Henshaw make a quiet noise of approval. They rode back to the homestead that afternoon, husband and wife, and the prairie was wide and the sky was enormous and beginning to show real blue, and the wheat was 2 inches higher than it had been the week before. April brought more growth, in every sense. The wheat was up strong and looking healthy, and Ida and Nelson talked every evening about the plans for the homestead, expanding the house frame addition with a second room before the baby came, which was still months away but which Ida had known since February, keeping the information close until she was certain. She told Nelson on a Tuesday evening in April, sitting at the table after supper, and watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, a sudden, unprepared openness, like a window being thrown up. He stood up from the table and came around it and pulled her up and held her, not dramatically but completely, his arms around her like a house, and said, "A baby." Just that, like he was testing the word. "In October, I think," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Maybe November." He pulled back and looked at her. "You are well, you are feeling well." "I am fine," she said. "Women have babies on homesteads all the time. My mother had me in a sod house in Nebraska. I intend to have a slightly better situation than that, but the principle is the same." "You will have a better situation," he said firmly. "I know," she said, and patted his arm, and he sat back down and then stood up again and sat down again, which was the most un-Nelson-like behavior she had ever seen from him, and she found it deeply endearing. Harlan Cross made one more attempt in April. It was, by then, clearly a diminished attempt, more a statement of principle than a real offensive. He sent his lawyer a letter to George Whitfield, asserting a water rights claim on the creek that ran along the south edge of the Talmadge property, arguing that the headwaters were on Cross's range, and therefore he controlled the downstream flow. George Whitfield responded with a very precise and well-researched letter citing Kansas water law, which in 1878 operated on the prior appropriation doctrine, meaning Ida's father's water rights, registered in 1875, predated Cross's competing claim by 2 years. The claim was dismissed within a month. It was, effectively, the end of Harlan Cross's campaign. He would not stop being a difficult neighbor. Exactly, men like Cross did not have a surrender in them. But he had lost every legal avenue. He had failed to intimidate Ida off the land, and he had managed to attract enough attention from the county that further aggressive actions would have consequences he was not willing to absorb. He withdrew to his own range and stewed, and the Talmadge homestead, now the Sheridan homestead by marriage, though Ida kept the name Talmadge in the property records out of love for her father, was left in peace. The summer was busy and good. The wheat grew tall and golden, and in July they harvested it, Nelson and 2 day laborers from Caldwell working the field while Ida managed the logistics with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. And when they loaded the last wagon and drove it to the grain buyer in Caldwell, the payment was enough to cover the lawyer's fees and the supplies they had bought on credit through the winter and still leave a meaningful sum in reserve. It was not wealth, but it was solid ground. Ida stood at the edge of the harvested field in the July heat and felt something settle into place in her chest, some final piece of a puzzle that had been scattered since January of the previous year. The land was secure, the debt was clear. Her father's wheat had come in 1 full year after he planted it, just as he had known it would. "We did it, Papa," she said quietly to the harvested field, to the summer sky, and then, because she believed it, she said, "Thank you." Nelson came and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. He did not say anything, because he understood that this moment was between Ida and her father and the land, and he simply stood there with her, which was exactly right. They expanded the house in August, adding a second room off the back of the frame addition, with a proper wood floor and a window that faced east so that the morning light would come in. They built it together, Nelson doing the heavy framing and Ida the finishing work, and they were still hanging the door when the September wind came back, the same wind that had been blowing the day Ida rode into Caldwell a year before, except that the world it was blowing through was entirely different. October came, and with it the baby. It was a boy. He arrived on a Thursday morning in early October with all the dramatic entrance of someone who has been waiting long enough and is done waiting, and the midwife from Caldwell, a capable woman named Mrs. Pratt, declared him healthy and loud, and possessed of an excellent set of lungs, all of which proved immediately and continuously accurate. Nelson sat on the edge of the bed with the baby in his arms and looked at him with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything important, like he was learning every detail by heart. Ida watched from the pillow, exhausted and sore and overwhelmingly, inconveniently happy. "He looks like my father," she said, because the baby had Samuel Talmadge's broad forehead and his square, determined chin. "He looks like you," Nelson said without looking up from the baby. "He can look like both of us," she said. "What do you want to name him?" They had talked about names during the long summer evenings. They had not settled on anything with full certainty, but they had circled around several options. Nelson looked up at her now. "Samuel," he said, "if you agree. After your father." Ida had not suggested it herself because she had not wanted to push, but she had hoped for it with a quiet intensity that she had not known how to express. She felt the tears that she had refused at Christmas finally arrive, just a few of them, dignified enough to be acceptable. "Yes," she said, "Samuel." "Samuel Talmadge Sheridan," Nelson said, trying it out, looking at the baby again. "That is a solid name." "It is a very good name," Ida agreed. Samuel Talmadge Sheridan opened his eyes, which were dark and not yet committed to a color, and looked at his father with an expression of profound and ancient skepticism. And Nelson laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that Ida could count on one hand the times she had heard, and the sound of it filled the new room with its east-facing window, and traveled through the solid walls of the expanded house, and out into the October morning, where the winter wheat was already in the ground again for another year. By the time Samuel was walking, unsteadily, ferociously, with the single-minded determination of someone who has somewhere to be, the homestead had continued to grow. They had added a small chicken house behind the barn, and a kitchen garden twice the size of the original, and Nelson had broken and planted an additional 15 acres in the spring, extending the wheat field to the north where the soil was deep and dark and good. They had a milk cow, 2 hogs, and a small flock of laying hens that Ida managed with the same efficiency she brought to the account books, which she kept meticulously and balanced to the penny. The Talmadge Sheridan homestead, as the neighbors had taken to calling it, accepting both names as equally part of the place, had become something her father would have recognized as the fulfillment of what he had begun. Not grand, not wealthy by the standards of men like Harlan Cross, who measured his holdings in square miles, but solid and productive, and real in the way that only things built slowly and cared for constantly can be real. Nelson had found land, as he had known he would. He had found it in the most literal sense, solid Kansas ground under his feet, property he had helped build into something more than it was. But he had also found what he had perhaps most been looking for without knowing it, which was a life that was genuinely shared. He had been a man who prided himself on needing no one, and Ida had been a woman who prided herself on the same thing, and together they had made something that required both of them and was the better for it. 2 years after Samuel was born, on a warm October afternoon when Samuel was running circles around the kitchen table, and the second baby was making itself known in the curve of Ida's body, she sat at that same kitchen table with the accounts open in front of her, and added the column of numbers for the 3rd time, and got the same answer all 3 times, which was a good answer. "Nelson," she called, and he came in from outside with his coat dusty from the field which he was preparing for fall planting. "What is it?" he said, coming to look over her shoulder at the accounts. "We can afford to put in a well house," she said. "A proper one with a pump so I am not hauling water from the open well in winter." She tapped the column, "and still have reserve for anything that needs it." Nelson looked at the numbers and then at her. "A well house," he said. "A well house," she confirmed. He pulled out the chair next to her and sat down and looked at the accounts, and then he looked at her, and his expression was the one she had come to know best, the careful, warm, complete attention that had noticed her from the first day and had never stopped noticing. "You know what your father would say," he said. "He would say it is a good use of what we have and a practical improvement," Ida said. "He would also say," Nelson said, "that his daughter had done him proud." Ida looked at the account book, and at the kitchen around her, the shelves with their row of canning jars, the books crowding the shelf now that had grown to include volumes on farming and medicine and several novels, the quilts hanging over the chairs, the children's drawings pinned to the wall beside the door, the fire burning steady in the stove. She looked through the east-facing window of the new room, where Samuel was currently engaged, in removing every item from a low shelf, with the methodical enthusiasm of a toddler on a mission. She thought about her father standing in this kitchen in the weeks before his illness took hold, pointing at the flat Kansas horizon, and telling her there was more out there than most people bothered to see. She thought about riding into Caldwell with 11 cents and a derringer, and a determination she could not have fully explained, and finding what she needed not in the form she had expected, but in the form that was exactly right. She thought about love, which had come to her not as a rescue but as a partnership, not as someone taking care of her but as someone standing beside her, and how that distinction made all the difference. "He would," she said quietly. She took Nelson's hand on the table deliberately, the way he had taken hers that firelit evening what felt like a lifetime ago. "We have done well." "We have," he said, and covered her hand with his other hand and held it warmly. "We are doing well, and we will keep doing well." Outside the east window, the Kansas sky was doing its fall thing, going from blue to a deep, particular gold in the late afternoon, and the harvested wheat field lay brown and resting and ready for the winter, and the new room smelled of wood and plaster, and the particular clean smell of a house that is cared for. Samuel had abandoned the shelf project and appeared in the doorway looking at his parents with the solemn, curious expression of a small person who knows something is happening that he does not yet have words for. "Come here, Sam," Nelson said, and Samuel crossed the floor with his rolling toddler gait, and Nelson lifted him up onto his knee, and the three of them sat together in the kitchen of the Talmadge homestead, while the October light turned golden and the wind came softly from the south, carrying the smell of the prairie and the turned earth and the distant cattle road, and everything that the year and the years before it and the years to come had added up to. Ida thought of all the women who had ridden into frontier towns with nothing but determination, and been turned back or broken down or swallowed up by the enormous difficulty of the land and the times, and the men who thought difficulty was a tool for removing those who should not stay. She thought about those women with something that was not quite grief and not quite anger but partook of both, a recognition of injustice that she would never entirely let go of, that she would teach her children to hold as well, because understanding what was wrong was part of understanding what was worth fighting for. She had been one of the fortunate ones. She knew that. She had held the land. She had found an honest man. She had built something real. But she also knew that her fortune had not come from luck alone. It had come from her father's care, from her own stubbornness, from George Whitfield's legal knowledge, from Mrs. Henshaw's pointed recommendation, from Nelson's steadiness and decency and willingness to stand at a fence line with a plat map and tell 3 armed riders that they were welcome to file a competing survey with the county. It had come from the accumulation of small, deliberate choices made by people who had decided that doing the right thing was worth the difficulty of doing it. The baby moved, a clear, decisive flutter of movement, and Ida put her free hand briefly against her side and felt it again, a new life making itself known. "The well house," Nelson said. "I was thinking we could start the framing before the ground freezes." "We have 3 weeks," Ida said. "If we start next week and the weather holds." "The weather will hold," he said, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had learned to read the Kansas sky in every season. "You do not know that," she said, with the comfortable certainty of a woman who knew he was probably right anyway. Samuel looked between them with his dark eyes, Ida's eyes, the same shape, the same directness, and said, with the seriousness of a small person who is working very hard at words, "Well." They both looked at him. "Well house," he said very carefully, like he had been listening to the whole conversation and had been waiting for his moment. Nelson looked at Ida. Ida looked at Nelson. They both looked at Samuel, who was satisfied with his contribution and now apparently ready to get down and attend to other business. Laughter came, real and full and unguarded, filling the kitchen, traveling through the solid walls of the house that held them, going out into the October evening where the light was golden, and the wheat field was resting, and the prairie was wide, and the sky was the particular hard Kansas blue that Ida Talmadge had decided, in the very first week she lived here, was the most beautiful color in the world. She had been right about that. She had been right about the land, and right about holding it, and right about the man. And in the warm kitchen of the house that had grown from her father's beginning, with the October light going gold and her husband laughing and her son looking very pleased with himself and a new life making itself known in the quiet ways that new lives do, Ida Talmadge Sheridan held all of it at once and found it was enough, and more than enough, and exactly what her father's note tucked inside his Bible had promised it would be. It was hers. It was good. It was home. The winter that followed was mild by Kansas standards, cold, certainly, but without the savagery of the first blizzard, and they moved through it with the practiced ease of people who had learned their way around a hard season. The well house went up before Christmas, properly framed and functional, and on the first morning Ida pumped water from it without walking out into the pre-dawn dark to the open well. She stood in the small timber structure in the weak winter light, and felt a satisfaction that was wildly disproportionate to the object of it, but she allowed herself that satisfaction completely. The second baby arrived in March, just as the first green began to push through the late winter gray. It was a boy again, which surprised no one more than Nelson, who had been quietly certain it would be a girl. He was born in the early morning hours when the birds were just beginning in the cottonwood by the well, and he was a large, calm, placid baby who seemed to have assessed the situation on arrival and found it acceptable. They named him Daniel Samuel Sheridan, Samuel for the grandfather, Daniel for Nelson's own father, two men who had built things in hard ground and left them for their children to continue. Mrs. Pratt, wrapping Daniel in the blanket Ida had made through the winter evenings, said, "2 boys under 2. That is a certain kind of adventure." "Everything worth doing is an adventure," Ida said, from the pillow. Mrs. Pratt looked at her with the expression of a woman who had attended enough births to have a sophisticated view of the relationship between adventure and exhaustion. "You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Sheridan." "I have good help," Ida said, and looked at Nelson, who was holding both of his sons, Samuel on his knee, Daniel in the crook of his arm, with the expression of a man who has received more than he dared to ask for and is not entirely sure what to do with the overflow. He looked up and found her watching him. He held her gaze for a moment with the full, undefended attention that had never changed since the beginning, that she suspected would never change, and said simply, "Thank you." She understood all of what he meant. "Thank you too," she said. Outside the east-facing window, the March light was coming up, pale and clear and full of the suggestion of spring, and the wheat was still under the last of the winter snow, but the green tips were showing through in the places the snow had thinned, pushing up the way wheat always pushes up, stubborn and purposeful and entirely indifferent to the difficulty, because it was what wheat did, what it had always done, what it would keep doing in the years ahead as long as the ground was good, and the people who worked it were willing to hold fast. And the Sheridans of the Talmadge homestead on the good Kansas ground south of the cattle road, 6 miles from Caldwell, with the Kishom Trail a distant rumble in the summer, and the prairie wide in every direction, held fast. They always had, and they always would.